The following program is made possible by Prescott Tire Pros and Automotive Service. Hello and welcome to the Prescott History Hour. I'm your host, John Krizek, and with me here in the studio is our preeminent historian, Nancy Burgess, who is leading us on a fantastic 1916 photographic tour of Prescott, Arizona. And this is all based on this collection of glass plate photos that you latched onto.
Yes.
That were buried in the basement of the Elks, I guess, for a long time.
Yes, they were. Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that collection and how it came to be?
Well, I think it came to be a collection by whoever left it in the Elks. And I think it's only part of the photographs that were probably taken in Prescott in 1916. But one of my co-workers, Dick Williams, knew about them and made some prints, came to me one day and at work and said, you know, I have all these old pictures, can we do a book? And once I saw them, I said, yeah, we can do a book. And so 10 years later, we had a book.
Well, it's a fascinating book, and for those of you who weren't here for the last program, this is actually the second of two programs devoted to this collection, which is really a treasure. In the previous program, in case you missed it, we visited a lot of the mercantile stores up and down Cortez. We saw a lot of buildings that you would still recognize today, including the Elks, with Bill Elk restored and on the roof to where he was in 1916. And Nancy had a lot to do with getting that done. And next to that is that Carnegie Library, which is there today. We also looked at the businesses along Cortez Street. There's the building that's still there today on the northwest corner of Gurley and Cortez, which included drugstores, banks, and so forth. We also, as an example of the mercantile stores of the day, this is J.S. Acker in his store. And that's on South Cortez.
Right.
And what kind of a store was this, Nancy?
It's a newsstand. So he carried cigars and postcards and stationery and school supplies and magazines, periodicals, newspapers. He had a little toy department. He loved kids,
so he sold a lot of stuff to kids.
Yeah, lots of school supplies.
Which makes the connection with Acker being connected to our Acker Night, which is such a wonderful tradition in this town.
Yes.
And he was the one responsible for that.
Well, he
connection.
provided funding in his will for programs for children, and it evolved into Acker Music Night.
And that's a wonderful local tradition. What we didn't cover the last time, which we're going to do today, is cover all these other areas, the drugstores with the soda fountains, and the hotels, the professional offices, the barbershops, the schools.
And don't forget the saloons.
And the saloons of Whiskey Row And boy, is that ever at the top of our subject list for today.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody wants to know about Whiskey Row.
Yes,
So we'll take them there today.
right.
Whiskey Row was in an interesting situation in 1916. And can you explain what was going on at that time?
Well, first of all of Whiskey Row, which started in the 300 block of South Montezuma, went up Montezuma into the North 100 block, across Gurley, up Cortez Street all the way to Sheldon. So now it's just that one block. Almost all of that burned in the fire of 1900. So by about 1902, the 100 block of South Montezuma across from the plaza had all been rebuilt, which is pretty amazing. And I have looked everywhere for photographs of those buildings under construction and have never found anything. But what affected Whiskey Row and a lot of other parts of downtown Prescott was Prohibition. So initially, certain states passed statutes that allowed cities, towns, counties to vote to go dry or stay wet. So for instance, in 1911, Phoenix voted to stay wet and Maricopa County voted to go dry. So if you lived out in the county or in one of the other communities, little communities, and you needed to go get a drink, you could just go into Phoenix and you could drink legally. But in 1914, Arizona voted to go dry, the whole state. And in 1916, that went into statutory requirement. And in January of 1920, the Volstead Act, which was the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, was passed. And the entire country went dry.
So in the U.S., we have this idea that Prohibition started in 1920, but here it started basically
1914.
in 1914. So we're looking here at the birdcage,
Mm-hmm.
which is obviously rather empty of customers.
Well, they have a dog.
They have dogs sleeping on the floor, but this is the birdcage in 1916.
And this is the same birdcage that burned in the fire on Whiskey Row in just a few years ago.
Yeah, a few years ago, yes.
It is no more.
And then we're looking at the new Golden Eagle on the northwest corner of Granite and Gurley.
Right, where the Valley National Bank
Where
is
the bank
today.
is. There's a bank.
Well, it used to be Valley National Bank, whatever it is today.
Yeah.
I can't keep up with their name changes.
And they're also rather bereft of customers. And we're looking at Mulvenans.
Mulvenans. Now, Mulvenan was the sheriff. This is what is now today the Gurley Street Grill.
The Gurley Street Grill, yes.
And that building, the Mulvenan building, or well, there's several ways to pronounce it, but was also well known as the Red Light District, part of it. But Sheriff Mulvenan owned the building and owned the bar. And again, there's not much going on.
There's not much going on, but is it fair to suspect that there was a certain amount of activity going on in the basements?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yes.
The day the pictures were taken, maybe Sheriff Ruffner was driving around the plaza because that's what he would do, and everybody would scatter. And
so the sheriff was warning everybody that he needed to do his job, so he'd cruise around the plaza, and the action would
disappear.
But down in the basement, they may have been imbibing.
There's no may about it.
They were.
Yeah, they brought a lot of liquor in from Mexico.
Yeah.
And of course, you could have it for medicinal purposes if your doctor wrote a prescription. And there were a few other exceptions. The church could have the wine for communion and those sorts of things. But there was a lot of protest against Prohibition, and it really had a negative effect on the economy, not only of Prescott, but of the entire country.
Yes, indeed. Well, this is still part of today's Whiskey Row, where the St. Michael's Hotel is. And we're looking here at the lobby of St. Michael's. And it's kind of hard to envision where this was. Would you see this if you came in at the corner?
You would.
Okay.
And that was still there in the early 1980s. That round banquette was still right there. The Indian rugs weren't on the floor, but the counter was there. It pretty much looked a lot like that.
So they pretty much rebuilt that whole place.
Yeah, it's the spaces have all been changed.
And yet
in
when
the
you
last
come in the side,
20 years or
when
so.
you come in off of Gurley,
Right.
you get the sense that that was where the registration desk is today. Was that
That was the ladies' entrance.
the ladies' entrance?
It was.
Okay. Well,
That's the way hotels were in those days.
times were different.
Yes, they were.
There's an ad for the St. Michael's, which I guess was a favorite place to stay.
Well, it was probably at that time the nicest hotel in Prescott. It was certainly the largest, and although the city business directory for Prescott for 1916 shows 16 hotels, and there was the St. Michael and the Brinkmeyer, the Head, the Lynn, the Windsor, the Reef, the Sherman House, Scopel's,
Now,
the Congress.
where were some of these hotels?
They were all downtown.
Were they all pretty much on the plaza? Or?
No, they were on East Gurley and North Cortez and East Goodwin, North Montezuma, but they were all downtown.
Was there any one of them that ranked up there with St. Michael's as a preferred place to stay?
The Congress was a pretty nice hotel, and it was where the Hacienda Inn is today.
Oh, okay.
And some of them were very small and run by families. The Lynn Hotel, for instance, Mr. Lynn had a jewelry store, and Mrs. Lynn ran the hotel, and they had a little they'd prepare box lunches and so forth. And it was on East Goodwin Street, and it was not very big. I don't know, maybe it had 8 or 10 rooms.
And the Hacienda that we know today was built in 1927, so
Right.
it didn't exist yet.
No.
But there was also the Brinkmeyer Hotel,
Right.
which, and that's the building that we see in this view, which was
Right.
taken, what, in 1905? we
About
figured.
1905, yes.
Yeah. And that building is certainly recognizable as still being there today.
Yes, it is.
The Brinkmeyer Hotel on North Montezuma. And there's this great picture of the lobby of the Brinkmeyer Hotel with the cast of characters sitting in the lobby.
Well, Henry Brinkmeyer came to Prescott in 1887, and he went into business as a baker. He was from Germany, and it was his mission to provide bread to the people of Prescott. So at the time and then he bought the Sumner House, which was on the same location as the Brinkmeyer Hotel is today. And that was a small hotel. And all of that burned in the fire of 1900. So he moved his bakery business out to Fort Whipple and used their bakery. and they still was producing bread and feeding the people of Prescott. And then he built the new building, which had a basement, still has a basement today, and it's much smaller than it was then. And so he had a bakery in the basement, and he had a restaurant, and he had rooms for rent, and he had electric lights, but they had gas for backup just in case.
Well, what's fascinating to me is that here's the bakery in the basement.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's the location of the Point bar today.
Okay. I know there's something
The
down there.
speakeasy that is a popular spot for some of us. I can't wait to share this picture with somebody there.
Yeah, this is the bakery, and you can see all the loaves of bread all lined up. And Herman's brother, or Henry's brother, Herman, he drove the wagon that delivered the bread. So they had a horse and a wagon. And on one day of the week he did the east side of town, and on another day of the week he did the west side of town.
In those days, the bakery truck came to your neighborhood.
Yeah. So one of the reasons there were so many hotels in Prescott in 1916 was that a lot of people lived in hotels, especially single men. They just lived in furnished rooms, and they may not have any other place to stay. Some of the miners would come in, and they'd stay maybe a month or a couple of months, and then they'd go back out to their claims. So it was more than just a tourist type, overnight stay type situation.
Also, there were restaurants.
There were lots of restaurants.
Lots of restaurants. And there's a picture of one here where was this one located? At Hotel St. Michael.
In the basement.
In the basement.
You can get into the basement off of Montezuma Street. You can also get to the basement off of Gurley.
On the Gurley side, there's
but that was all storage.
That was storage.
Yeah, that's more like a garage.
So the main entrance, it's all blocked off there, but it's right on the sidewalk in front of St. Michael's.
Right.
So that was a busy restaurant downstairs.
Most of the restaurants were pretty busy. It doesn't show in these photos, maybe because of the time of day, but you can see they had white tablecloths, and some of them had seating at the lunch counter. The Hacienda had a lunch counter in what is now the Peacock Room. It was completely different from what it is today.
I can imagine. What is this, where is this restaurant that we're looking at?
The Owl?
The Owl.
The Owl was in the basement of the Wilson Block, and we'll see a picture of that a little bit later, but the Owl was famous for being the place to go for a treat. They had their own handmade candies. They had a soda fountain. It was a great place to go to get a sandwich. Families would walk downtown from their homes on the weekends and get dinner at the Owl, and the children loved. This is
the Wilson Block in this picture.
Right there on the corner.
Right there on the corner of Gurley and Montezuma.
So you can see where the sidewalk slants down to the left from the corner.
Yeah.
And you can see the windows to the basement right there. And so lots of people have written about the Owl and when they were kids and going with their families and getting to pick out candy, or they had fine chocolates, they had cameras, they had all kinds of things.
Well, now, according to the ad, drug and candy companies offering sporting goods and cameras. Was that in the restaurant, or was that?
That was upstairs.
Upstairs.
Yeah. And then included in that building, and you can't see it in that picture, but to the west, which would be the left, was the Hotel Annex, which is part of that building today.
Hotel Annex?
Annex.
Was it a different hotel or is it just
It's part of the same building, but yeah, it was a different
different?
hotel. Yeah.
So we're looking at this picture of another restaurant. Was this also in a basement somewhere? Or
I don't think so, based on the light from the doors. But I could never figure out where this was.
There's
But
light
they have a
coming
lunch
in.
counter, yeah, and they have the little rooms over on the right-hand side, probably with booths. So most of the downtown buildings, the basic size was 25 feet wide, and a lot of them were only 25 feet wide. Now, some of the bigger buildings, like the Palace and so forth, of course, were much bigger than that.
So, and here's the Windsor House restaurant on West Gurley.
Right across from the plaza.
And I think you've noted that there is a Chinese gentleman in the back there.
This was a Chinese-run restaurant, and it was the first restaurant in Prescott to have electric lights. And that was a big deal.
And this was in that block right across from the plaza.
Right in the middle of the block.
Right in the middle. What about the Chinese presence in Prescott in those days? There's another picture here of a Chinese laundry.
Right. Well, I went through the 1910 census because that's the only place I could get the information. Now, in 1910, the population was about 3,100 in Prescott, total population. That did not count, that's in the city limits. That doesn't count people out on the ranches and out in the county. And there were about 200 Chinese. Most of them were single men, but there were a few women and a few families. And they had grocery businesses. They worked as cooks. They worked as domestics, gardeners. They were shop owners. They owned laundries. They worked out on the mines and as cooks, and also they did a lot of mining themselves. And the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed in 1882 and extended in 1892, really cut down on the number of Chinese coming into this country. So many of them arrived in this country in the 1870s and 80s, and quite a few of the Chinese that were in Prescott were native-born American citizens. Most of them came from California, because there was a large Chinese presence in California. People always think about the Chinese building the railroads, but that's not the case in Prescott.
But then after a while, they're not here anymore, or?
Well, their tradition was that they would go back to China. They would make a nice amount of money here, and they would go back to their families. Or if they passed away here, they would be shipped back to China. So a lot of them left over the years, and then a lot of them were deported to Mexico later on.
Later on,
Yeah.
not in this
1920s.
period. 1920s.
Yeah.
Well, moving on, there's another long counter here, a soda fountain. Looks like, is that Timmeroff's?
Timmeroff's.
Timmeroff's. Where was?
Timmeroff was the mayor of Prescott, and he was quite the entrepreneur. He had a drugstore. He catered to the ladies. He had all kinds of cosmetics and skin creams, and he had the soda fountain, obviously, and he had a livery business, and he actually hired local young men, boys, high school students who had bicycles to deliver the drugs to people who ordered them. So that wouldn't be happening today, obviously. But it was a good way for some of the younger guys to earn a little bit of money. So he had a lovely store.
And that was on Cortez.
North Cortez on the east side of the street. The building's still there.
Another feature was barbershops.
Yes.
And I guess there were several, but
Yes, there were.
this is a picture taken in one of the most popular barbershops.
Yes,
right?
it was. Yes, this was considered to be the barbershop to go to. Garrett's.
Garrett's, and it was also on Gurley.
Yes, right across from the plaza.
And there are some great stories about how the cowboys would come to town full of mud and whatever, and they'd go into a back room and basically take a bath.
Yes, they had baths.
They had baths.
Yes, and you could get your shoes shined and your hair cut and take a bath and change your clothes and
They'd get all cleaned up
and go hit Whiskey Row.
and hit Whiskey Row, except because of Prohibition, they had ways to accommodate that.
Yeah.
They had ways to accommodate
Yeah,
that.
the tradition was that they would hit Whiskey Row, but
yeah.
this particular time they weren't doing so much of that. So as you can see, Garrett's Barbershop, the barbers are all black. Mr. Garrett was black. And again, I went through the 1910 census, and there were about 100 black people in Prescott at that time, mostly single men, but there were a number of families. And when we look at the pictures of the schools, we'll see some of those children. And there were a few women. And
We're going to meet one of them later in this
yes,
program.
we are. We are going to meet, yes, Madam Hunter. We're going to meet her. So way in the back of this photograph, you'll see the shaving mugs. Now, each person who came to that barber shop on a regular basis had their own shaving mug. And so the barber would go get it off the shelf, and he would use that shaving mug for that person when they were getting a shave.
And that's a tradition that has existed for a long time.
Yes, and all the barbershop photos in this particular collection show that.
Well, we're going to have to take a break here. And before we do, I just wanted to remind everyone about the book from which a lot of these photos are taken, or at least they're in here.
All of them.
All of them. And this is the book that Nancy's an author of.
Yes.
A photographic tour of Prescott in 1916, and this is a book that is found where?
The gift shop at Charlotte Hall Museum.
Charlotte Hall, the Peregrine.
The Peregrine and the Phippen
The Phippen.
gift shop, and sometimes the Old Sage bookstore has it. And of course, you can always find it
Always find it online.
online. Yes.
Thank you very much, Nancy. We'll be right back. This program is made possible by Prescott Tire Pros and Automotive Service. Located out on Iron Springs Road, this is a full-service tire and automotive repair and maintenance business. Here's the happy crew out at Prescott Tire. That's owner Louis Gomez in the middle, with his wife Angel, who handles the office. They've been in business in Prescott for over 20 years and have 14 full-time people on staff, including 2 master certified technicians who are constantly getting recertified. And they take great pride in their work. They also take pride in supporting many local charitable causes, including a unique program of donating recycled vehicles to people in need. So that's Prescott Tire, out on Iron Springs Road, which has made this Prescott History Hour program possible. Welcome back to the Prescott History Hour. I'm your host, John Krizek, and with me here is Nancy Burgess, and we're enjoying this 1916 photographic tour of Prescott. Nancy, one of the landmarks in this town is the Armory building on East Gurley,
Right.
which is named after a lady named Grace Sparks.
Yes.
And she must have been a pretty important person in this town.
She was the mover and shaker in this town. And she came to Prescott at the age of 14 in 1906. And she graduated from St. Joseph's Academy from high school in 1910. And then she went down to Phoenix to go to the Lamson's Business School, which interestingly my mother used to teach at. And she came back to Prescott and became the secretary of the Yavapai County Chamber of Commerce at the age of 19 in 1911. And she just hit the ground running. She was a very confident young woman and very smart, and she had lots of good ideas for the Yavapai County Chamber of Commerce. So in 1914, just 3 years later, she started Yavapai Magazine. And if you want to know what was really going on in Yavapai County in 1914 through about 1919, that magazine is amazing.
Are there copies of that magazine around? Can they be found?
Charlotte Hall Museum has a full collection on microfilm. It's a lot to do with boosterism, which we talked about earlier, and promoting Prescott. And she got all kinds of information, all kinds of photographs. I wish I knew where all those photographs were, because I've never seen a lot of them anyplace else except in the magazine. So I wish I knew what happened to those. But in 1920, she helped start the fund drive for the Hacienda Hotel. And in 1921, she helped organize the Smoke Eye as a fundraiser for the rodeo. She actually wrote the rules for rodeo, which are still used today internationally. She was known as one of the three Graces of Prescott: Grace Sparks, Grace Chapman, and Charlotte Hall. And those three women could get just about anything done.
That's who was the go-to trio to get something done.
They were the go-to trio. She was a secretary at her organizations that she either started or belonged to fills 3 pages. But she was a secretary of the Northern Arizona State Fair and the Prescott Rodeo.
When was that Armory building that bears her name built?
1939.
Okay, so that was later.
That was later, but she was in charge of the Works Progress Administration projects in Prescott. And Prescott started their own little sort of Works Progress Administration before the federal government started theirs during the Depression. But she was she was the Yavapai County Immigration Commissioner. She was on the Arizona Board of Welfare. The buildings under her supervision for the WPA included the Charlotte Hall building, which is the stone building at the museum, the hospital at Fort Whipple, the Smoke Eye buildings, Ken Lindley Field, Prescott High School, which is now Prescott Mile High Middle School, the Goldwater Dam, bridges in downtown Prescott, the restoration of Tuzigoot, and this building, the Armory.
Too much.
So she was amazing.
Well, getting back to 1916, one of the businesses in town that we wanted to talk about is clothing businesses and clothing stores. And we're looking here at one of the men's clothing stores. Would you tell us about it?
Yes, but first I'm going to tell you a little bit about ready-to-wear, because Oscar Bruckman was kind of the pioneer in Prescott for bringing men's ready-to-wear into Prescott. And ready-to-wear started during the Civil War with companies making uniforms. They couldn't make a uniform to fit each and every person. So they established a sizing system and they started making them en masse. But, you know, kind of the upper crust wasn't too interested in that. But by 1916, Bashford Burmester and a number of the mercantile stores are carrying some ready-to-wear. So Oscar Bruckman advertised that he had no special sales, that his merchandise was fairly priced, and he started to sell ready-to-wear menswear. And everyone said, he's never going to last, he won't last 6 months. Well, he was very successful. And by 1916, he had moved across the street from his small store into a bigger store on the east side of Cortez in the head block. And he was a very successful businessman and very well liked. And so that's kind of his story. And he did a lot of advertising. I had 5 or 6 ads for him, all from the same day.
And the Wilson block, there was also a major men's clothing store there, wasn't there?
Yeah, Joseph Wilson.
Wilson, that was another one.
Yeah. Well, he never really recovered from the fire of 1900, but he was an older man at the time of the fire, so his clothing business didn't last too long. But yes, there were quite a few men's clothing stores there, and there were a number of tailors who were still making custom-made clothing.
Yes.
And so Goldwater's carried both men's and women's clothing, and there was Biles Lockhart, which was the upper crust men's clothing store, and was a beautiful store. It'd be so nice to walk into a store today and see things displayed the way they did it in 1916.
And when it came to women's clothing, you see the term millinery.
Millinery.
A lot. We're looking at, what are we looking at here? Whose shop is this?
I don't know whose shop this is, but everybody wore hats. If you look at pictures of people out on the street, everyone had on a hat, and women had on, they were past the big picture hat style of the Victorian years, and things were becoming smaller and a little less decorated. But they would pick out a hat, and then the shop owner would help them pick out the decorations for the hat, the ribbon and the flowers.
Of course,
and
if they were
whatever.
riding around in those open cars of the day, there was a lot of dust, and they didn't have, they weren't taking showers every day, and they didn't have a lot of the blow dryers and everything else. So,
but everyone wore hats when they were driving the cars in those days. So millinery shops were very popular and very important, and those shops mostly transitioned to women's wear.
Well, tell us about Agnes Todd.
Agnes Todd was a young woman who came, I think, from Flagstaff to Prescott, and she was a single lady, and she wanted to rent space in the Arizona Bank building. And they said, we're not going to rent to a woman. But one of the local businessmen who knew her from Flagstaff came in and said, you need to rent to this woman. She'll be a good client and a good customer, and she'll bring people into your bank. And so they did. And she had a store in Prescott for many, many, many years, clear into the 1940s.
Good. And here's another millinery, ladies' shop. Madam Hunter?
Yeah, well, Madam Hunter's wasn't a millinery shop. Madam Hunter, she did carry some hats, but her main focus was on women's health. And she was a widow, and she had a couple of children. She was a black lady. And she promoted cosmetics that were good for your skin, not a lot of the stuff that they had in those days. They had all kinds of chemicals and things in it. And she sold accessories and some women's clothing. and she was very respected in the community.
Good. Well, let's move on to some of the other offices in town at that time. Of course, we had lawyers.
Of course, we had lawyers, yes. We had a lot of lawyers, actually. And most of them were in the Prescott National Bank building, the Arizona Bank building, the Bashford building, the Union Block, the Electric building, and in the Elks. So they were all downtown, across the street from the courthouse. Now, the interesting thing about the courthouse is that the courthouse that's there today was not there, and the courthouse that was there previously was not there either. So the county had rented space all over downtown Prescott for various departments, and they actually held court in the Elks.
Court in the Elks. Mm-hmm. But there was that courthouse before the courthouse that's there today.
But that had been torn down by 1916.
Oh, it was torn down.
They set the cornerstone for the current courthouse in October of 1916.
Okay, so this was that period of time when in 1916 there was no courthouse, so that there were all these offices all around the square. And there's, of course, a picture of a lawyer on the phone. What do you know?
Yeah, of course. That's Joe Morgan.
Okay.
And his secretary has a typewriter.
A typewriter, oh yes. Some of us do remember typewriters.
And speaking of telephones, they had come into Prescott fairly early on, and by 1912 the little telephone company had been bought out by Mountain Bell. And if you've been in Arizona for a long time, you'll know that Mountain Bell is the predecessor to the current CenturyLink telephone company.
Ah yes, the coming of the telephone. We also had a pretty active mining industry at that time.
We certainly did.
Here's a picture of a couple of mining engineers in their office. I guess in 1916, World War I was going on in Europe.
Right, but not in the U.S.
We weren't in it yet, but apparently that had stimulated a lot of growth in the copper business, which had a lot to do with...
There were 151 mining companies listed in Yavapai County in the 1916 business directory.
Wow. So there really was a lot of mining activity.
Yeah, that doesn't count all the little individual mines that people had. Those are actual mining companies. And of course, we had Prescott Mining Supply, or Arizona Mining Supply, which supplied all, including dynamite. And you could still buy dynamite in Prescott in 1980. And there were a number of mining engineers, 4 companies. I don't know who these 2 gentlemen are, but
they were one among many.
Well, there were 4 mining engineering companies in town, and there were assayers, and there were mining offices of mining companies, so there was a lot of mining presence.
And here's a picture in the newspaper office of the day, the Prescott Journal-Miner.
Yes.
Was that the newspaper, or?
That was the newspaper at that time. Interestingly, they were in the Otis building on the corner of Union and Cortez on the northeast corner. And there's a big solid wall that faces Union Street. So when there were baseball games on, they'd have somebody, they'd put a big baseball diamond on the wall, and they'd have somebody out there with a big stick with things on it that they would move the runners around the bases, and they'd give the scores.
Was this a game, or was this
No,
reporting?
this was reporting baseball games, which were coming in over the radio.
Okay, so it was radio that was bringing the game, and then they would mark it on their wall.
Yeah.
Well, this guy looks like he's got his hat on, like he's ready to run out to cover a story.
He probably is.
And then there's the schools.
Right.
And we're looking here at the principal of Washington School.
Right, Glenn Persons. So there were 5 schools basically in Prescott at this time. There was Washington, Lincoln, Miller Valley, which we all know today, Prescott High School, which was right across the street from Washington School, between Alarcon and Marina on Gurley. And then there was St. Joseph's Academy, which was a Catholic school.
And here's a picture of a school class, probably about the 5th grade at the Washington School. There's another picture of another class. I guess they're outdoors posing here.
Yeah, they're out in front of the school.
And another picture of a class at Lincoln School. And this is probably what, 5th, 6th grade?
I think so, based on the height and clothing.
And here's an interesting picture from inside at Prescott High School.
Domestic science.
Domestic science.
Yes. And we have a really interesting ad from the Haciamper, which is the Prescott High School yearbook, which still is today, about what they were teaching in high school in 1916. They had English, math, history, science, ancient and modern languages, library, gymnasium, laboratories, a commercial department, I'm not real sure what that means, music theory, chorus, band, orchestra, and glee club, manual training in domestic science, athletics, public speaking, and dramatics, and military training, and is fully accredited to the State University and the North Central Association of Colleges. That's quite an accomplishment for a small town like Prescott that has less than 5,000 people.
That's great. That's great. A great tradition.
And of course, everybody went to Prescott High School. All the kids from the ranches came in, and you know, Chino Valley didn't have a high school. Prescott Valley didn't exist.
And while we've got some time, there's some other things that I wanted to visit. One is the PG&E plant, which was, of course, the source of our power in town. Now that was, you say, at the north end of McCormick Street?
Yes.
Is near the railroad, I presume?
Yes. Actually, there's a very small little building that you would not notice unless you looked for it. It's built in 1892, I think. That's kind of a leftover from Prescott Gas and Electric. That became a brownfield site, and they had a huge amount of cleanup to do up there at one time, probably 15, 18 years ago. But yes, it was quite an industrial plant.
That would have been near the trestle that's still there today?
It's further west.
Further west.
Yeah.
Okay. And here's a picture of the PG&E office, which is in that busy stretch of North Cortez. And an ad,
Yeah.
of course, they were trying to get more people to buy electricity.
Right, I love this ad. This is so funny. It says, "Attention housewife. We have them all. If you want them all, you can get all." And they're talking about electric appliances. So they have the El Grillo, the El Perco, the El Chafo, the El Tosto, the Iron. I guess they couldn't come up with a funny name for that. And the El Tostivo, and I don't know what that is. But then they say, "Let the electric motor do your heavy work, pump your water, run your hoist." So the housewives, I don't think were running too many hoists. But
No, but getting used to electrical service was a new thing.
oh yes,
at the time.
They were kind of afraid of those electric appliances, and that office was in the Masonic building.
And another thing that was still popular in the day, or well known, Wells Fargo. I mean, we all think of the Wells Fargo
Bank.
Express, and it existed in those days.
Oh yes, they handled a lot of transfers of money in various different ways. They shipped things.
It wasn't just shipping things; it was transferring money.
That's the way they really got started, was transferring money. gold bullion, silver
Yeah.
bullion, and then later on, similar to what today we would call an electronic transfer. But of course, it was done by telegraph and.
So how did they, I mean, were they shipping things
Oh,
in
yeah.
those days?
They advertised that they could ship anything.
Okay.
So
You-
they shipped mostly, in these days, they'd be shipping by rail
By
for the
rail.
most part.
Yes. Okay. And another site that a name that we still recognize because it's in the sidewalk on Montezuma Street is Sam Hill's Hardware Store.
Right, and the building is still there. Sam Hill came to Prescott and started a tin shop. And when the fire of 1900 occurred, of course, his tin shop burned to the ground. But he had a shipment of lumber coming to Prescott, or to Jerome, actually, and he was able to get them to divert that and bring it to Prescott. And he was the first one to have a building started on the Whiskey Row after the fire.
After the big
He was
fire.
also the first automobile dealer, and those are the Fords that he carried sitting out in front of the store in one of his ads. He carried all kinds of things for vehicles, but he also carried spring wagons and tack and rifles and all kinds of household goods. Now, he died in 1902, and his family continued to run the business, his son George, until sometime in the 1960s.
One of the things that I see in these ads are phone numbers, and it's interesting. In this case, phone 16 black.
Right.
What did that mean?
Well, if you've had a phone long enough, you remember when your phone number started with 2 letters.
You know,
Yeah.
that wasn't that long ago.
It wasn't that long ago. And if you have a phone number here in Prescott that starts with 44, that was HI, Hickory. And so BL, it was black. So the phone number was 16, just 2 numbers. Some were 3 numbers. The lowest number I've seen was 3. And so
But if you have a phone number today that's 445,
Right.
which a lot of them are,
yeah, it's Hickory.
that's really Hickory.
Right.
That's interesting.
But you didn't dial up a number in 1916. You called the operator, and
Yeah.
she put you through to whoever it was you wanted to talk to.
Oh yeah, the operator days. And the car, of course, the automobile was coming into popular use.
Well, it wasn't really popular yet because it was pretty expensive, but there were a lot of new businesses that were geared to the automobile, and this is one of them, Massing's Garage.
Massing's Garage,
Now
and this
he's-
was where?
This is on the 200 block of North Cortez Street, and they were storing cars. So we didn't have a parking garage. People didn't have garages. They had carriage houses, and they really probably weren't necessarily set up for an automobile, so they stored cars. And there's a little speeder way back in the back of this garage, so they had some interesting automobiles, and there were quite a number of businesses geared toward the automobile that were
yes.
springing up.
The age of the automobile was here, but still there were blacksmiths
There were.
because there was still a need for blacksmiths. And this particular blacksmith shop is where? Southeast corner of
Goodwin and Montezuma. This is
Goodwin.
the Plaza Blacksmith Shop. And they had a livery next door. This was a very large building on the corner between where the Prescott Chamber of Commerce building is today and the corner. It took that entire block. And of course, many people couldn't afford cars, so they still had horses. And the ranchers all used horses. And so the blacksmiths were still busy. And they were also fixing and making parts for cars when things broke,
Yeah.
and things broke a lot.
Well, it was a time of great transition
It was.
in our town. But one thing that has remained consistent is our hospitality
Right.
and our welcoming hand to tourists and making the town better by patronizing home trade. I love that ad, and we'll use it to encourage shopping local.
Yes.
Well, Nancy, it's been so great to have this 1916 photo tour of Prescott, and thank you so much for all of your work and your knowledge and leading us on this tour.
Thank you very much. It's been fun.